Good evening. It's Monday, August 31st. Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden charges President Trump is encouraging violence in the streets following deadly clashes between pro-Trump supporters and anti-racism protesters.
This president long ago forfeited any moral leadership in this country. He can't stop the violence because for years he's fomented it.
Wisconsin's governor and the mayor of Kenosha want him to stay away, but President Trump says he'll stick with his plans for a visit tomorrow. Kenosha's the city where a police officer seriously wounded Jacob Blake, and a 17-year-old Trump supporter is charged with fatally shooting two protesters. Trump says the visit will be a positive.
Also increase enthusiasm, and it could increase love and respect for our country, and that's why I'm going.
California lawmakers headed toward approval of a compromise bill to extend some eviction protections. Despite a warning from tenants' rights groups, the measure is confusing and not strong enough. Lawmakers who support the measure seem to agree.
This measure is simply a 6-month bridge for both tenants and landlords. This bill, by no stretch of the imagination, is an end-all, be-all solution to the crisis.
An uphill battle to pass a bill to increase taxes on the state's wealthiest residents, some of whom have seen their net worth increase exponentially since the pandemic began. The head of the Food and Drug Administration says he may authorize deployment of a vaccine before Stage 3 trials are completed, drawing renewed condemnation that the nation's top health officials are caving into pressure from the president. And a historic flight from Israel to the United Arab Emirates with Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner aboard. Palestinian leaders denounced the diplomatic breakthrough as a violation of the Arab position on the Mideast conflict. From KPFA Berkeley and KPFK Los Angeles, this is the Pacifica Evening News. I'm Eileen Alfandary. President Trump and Democratic challenger Joe Biden sparred over the issue of violence on the streets of the country. In an afternoon press conference, Trump doubled down on his multiple tweets during the day when he accused Biden of blaming the police far more than he was blaming, quote, rioters, anarchists, agitators, and looters. He tweeted that the, quote, radical left mayors and governors of cities where what he called crazy violence is taking place have lost control of their movement. We'll have a full report on Trump's afternoon briefing in a few minutes. For his part, Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden forcefully condemned violence and property damage at recent protests against police shootings and racial injustice. At the same time, Biden blamed Trump for stoking violent attacks and for failing to call on his own supporters to stop acting as an armed militia in this country.
We've arrived at a moment in this campaign we all knew, including the press in front of me, knew we'd get to. The moment when Donald Trump would be so desperate he'd do anything to hold on to power. Donald Trump has been a toxic presence in our nation for 4 years, poisoning how we talk to one another, poisoning how we treat one another, poisoning the values this nation has always held dear, poisoning our very democracy. Now, in just a little over 60 days, we have a decision to make. Will we rid ourselves of this toxin? Or will we make it a permanent part of our nation's character?
The speech marked a new phase of the campaign as Biden steps up his own travel after largely remaining near his home in Wilmington, Delaware, to prevent the spread of the coronavirus. And after centering his candidacy on accusing Trump of mishandling the pandemic, Biden is making a broader push to argue the country won't be safe if Trump wins re-election. Biden denounced violence, property damage, and theft that have accompanied some of the protests.
The senseless violence of looting and burning and destruction of property. I want to make it absolutely clear, something very clear about all of this. Rioting is not protesting. Looting is not protesting. Setting fires is not protesting. None of this is protesting. It's lawlessness, plain and simple. And those who do it should be prosecuted.
Biden also accused Trump of being too weak to call out his own supporters to stop acting as armed militia. And he leaned on his own 47-year career in politics to defend himself against Republican attacks. Biden said, "You know me, you know my heart, you know my story, my family's story. Ask yourself, do I look like a radical socialist with a soft spot for rioters?" "Really?" Biden asked. He was speaking from the battleground state of Pennsylvania. Some residents in Kenosha, Wisconsin, fear tomorrow's planned visit by President Trump will lead to more violence. Trump said he's coming even after Wisconsin's governor and the mayor of Kenosha asked him not to. He'll tour damage and meet with law enforcement in the wake of the police shooting of Jacob Blake, which left the father of 6 with severe injuries, and a young vigilante's fatal shooting of 2 protesters. At his briefing today, Trump lambasted the radical left. He defended his supporters, including the right-wing protesters who attacked anti-racist demonstrators in Portland, and he defended Kyle Rittenhouse, the 17-year-old armed vigilante who allegedly shot and killed 2 anti-racist protesters. Christina Onnested reports.
The world, or at least the U.S., according to President Donald Trump, is a scary place. And it'll be even scarier should Democrats win the 2020 election. During a press briefing, the president lamented what he called the radical left, who have taken over the Democratic Party and spread anti-American hatred across the land. He pointed to Oakland, Chicago, New York, and Portland.
This is the extreme left's agenda for America. They want to appoint radical prosecutors, judges, and federal officials who will set criminals free. Their stated plan is to cut police funding, abolish cash bail, close down prisons, re-educate our children, preach left-wing social justice, establish a national sanctuary for criminal illegal aliens, and abolish the death penalty, even for cop killers. No one will be safe, and in fact, they want very much to let people in prison, like as an example, the Boston bomber. They want to let everybody vote.
The solution, according to the president, is another 4 years of Trumpian rule, law and order, a crackdown and arrest of protesters who have rallied across the country for racial justice, and an end to police killings of people of color. Trump says his administration is reviewing hundreds of hours of videotape to identify rioters and looters to arrest them. He puts the blame of civil unrest on the radical left, who he says carry an anti-police and anti-American sentiment. His comments come 2 days after a group of his supporters caravanned through Portland, some with paintball guns and knives, and in trucks trying to run over protesters during the Trump 2020 Cruise rally in Portland. Trump went so far as to retweet a video of his supporters with paintball guns. But this time, one of them ended up dead in a fatal shooting. Aaron J. Danielson with Patriot Prayer was shot and killed. It was caught on video. Instead of condemning the violence, Trump went after Antifa and defended his supporters.
But that was a peaceful protest. And paint is not, and paint as a defensive mechanism, paint is not bullets. Your supporters, and they are your supporters indeed, shot a young gentleman who, and killed him, not with paint, but with a bullet. And I think it's disgraceful. These people, they protested peacefully. They went in very peacefully.
Trump also spoke favorably and empathetically of Kyle Rittenhouse, the 17-year-old armed vigilante whose mother drove him to Kenosha, Wisconsin, where he allegedly killed 2 anti-racist protesters last week after a police shooting paralyzed a black man, Jacob Blake, and ignited civil unrest in that city. Trump, though, is suggesting the 17-year-old acted in self-defense.
That was an interesting situation. You saw the same tape as I saw. And he was trying to get away from them, I guess, it looks like. And he fell. And then they very violently attacked him. And it was something that we're looking at right now, and it's under investigation. But I guess he was in very big trouble. He probably would have been killed, but it's under investigation.
The president is set to visit Kenosha, but he says he won't be visiting with the family of Blake because they want a lawyer present. But speaking to local media, Blake's cousin, Justin Blake, says the family doesn't want to meet with Trump, whose rhetoric is only increasing tensions in their community and adding to division.
Our family don't particularly want to have anything to do with him. We believe he incited this violence, and that's why it's flooding over. People think they have the right to do anything.
Wisconsin's Democratic governor has sent a letter to President Trump urging him to stay away from Kenosha as the community attempts to heal. The mayor of Kenosha, John Antaramian, also asked Trump to suspend his visit.
This community is trying to heal. We're trying to pull together. And I think that at this point in time, it's not the best idea.
Trump has received backlash for failing to condemn his supporters in other protests, including the white nationalists who protested against civil rights activists in North Carolina. Tensions in that rally led to one woman being killed. Trump is set to visit Wisconsin Tuesday. Meanwhile, authorities in Portland say they've identified a suspect in the shooting death of Trump supporter Aaron J. Danielson as 48-year-old Michael Raynal, an Antifa supporter who formerly served in the military. I'm Christina Onnested reporting for KPFA.
Oregon Governor Kate Brown has announced Oregon State Police will patrol Portland's nightly protests with reinforcements from officers from neighboring communities. The Oregon governor's announcement followed the fatal shooting of a right-wing Trump supporter as the city approaches 100 consecutive nights of demonstrations against police violence and racial injustice. Those protests began with the Minneapolis police killing of George Floyd. Governor Kate Brown's plan also creates a group including Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler and local black leaders to help chart the path forward for Portland. Police have not made an arrest in the case, although, as Christina Onnested reported, the Oregonian reported that a 48-year-old man who was accused of carrying a loaded gun at an earlier downtown Portland protest is under investigation. The Oregonian says he calls himself an anti-fascist and has posted videos and photos of demonstrations he attended since late June. A reporter spoke to the man's sister, who said he was estranged from the family and had been, quote, very impulsive and irrational. Governor Brown has so far declined to send the National Guard to Portland, but instead announced the coalition of multiple law enforcement agencies to patrol the city. In a statement, she said right-wing groups like Patriot Prayer had come to Portland looking for a fight and vowed to stop more bloodshed in the city's streets. Some black community leaders were upset with the plan to put more officers on the streets. Portland police have come under fire for extensively using tear gas against protesters while giving right-wing, pro-police, and pro-Trump militia a pass. Shanice Clark, one of the founders of the Black Millennial Movement, said the odds of racial justice protesters getting arrested are almost so high as to the point of being guaranteed. She also criticized a news conference held by Wheeler on Sunday when the Portland mayor blasted Trump. She called Wheeler's comments political theater. During that press conference, Wheeler delivered a blistering attack on the president. The Portland mayor noted the previous day's events began with hundreds of cars filled with the president's supporters staging a rally before driving to downtown Portland.
Do you seriously wonder, Mr. President, why this is the first time in decades that America has seen this level of violence? It's you who have created the hate and the division. It's you who have not found a way to say the names of black people killed by police officers, even as people in law enforcement have. And it's you who claimed that white supremacists are good people. Your campaign of fear is as anti-democratic as anything you've done to create hate and vitriol in our beautiful country.
That's Portland's mayor. This is the Pacifica Evening News on KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles. I'm Eileen Alfandary. Before Portland's mayor spoke, the Oregon Justice Resource Center and allied progressives groups called on him to resign. They said Wheeler, who's also the police commissioner, has let Portland police use tear gas against protesters on multiple occasions and had failed to deal with violence perpetrated by Patriot Prayer and other right-wing groups over recent years. Bobin Singh heads the Justice Resource Center.
Violence being perpetrated by law enforcement and also the increased presence of vigilante justice by alt-right groups has created conditions in an environment that can no longer be sustained. I think what we saw last night is something all of us in this from these organizations have been concerned about and have predicted for the past several years now, that someone would die in the streets of Portland. We don't take this call to resignation lightly, but we're doing so because we are, at this point, afraid for additional harms that are going to be caused to our community.
Olivia Cappy-Smith is co-chair of the Portland chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America. She noted that the previous weekend, pro-Trump militia members had also confronted protesters in the streets while police stood by.
Where they brought firearms, they were shooting paintball guns, they were pointing actual firearms at left-wing protesters. The police stood by and did nothing. But as soon as those right-wing protesters left, the police and the federal officers came out in full force, declared it a riot, had plenty of energy and fumes for that part of it, and just stood by to allow these right-wing protesters to intimidate and attack left-wing protesters. And I think that is what the dynamic was last night. They wanted there to be conflict last night. They wanted these two groups to clash last night. They wanted to stand by and allow these Trump protesters to come in and do what they were going to do, which ended in someone dying.
Olivia Cappy-Smith, the co-chair of the Portland chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America, speaking yesterday. Portland's mayor said he has no intention of resigning. He is running for re-election in the fall. Supporters of legislation that would allow California police officers who commit serious misconduct to be permanently stripped of their badges were twisting arms and calling out reluctant lawmakers. They struggled for votes on one of the year's top policing reform bills. The measure would create a way to decertify California police officers. California is one of only 5 states without such a provision. The measure got a late boost from celebrity Kim Kardashian West, who tweeted, "It's needed so officers are held accountable if they break the law." Police unions and organizations representing police chiefs and sheriffs claimed they supported the concept, but said they opposed the details in the legislation by State Senator Stephen Bradford. The legislature separately sent another Bradford bill to Governor Gavin Newsom for his signature. It would require youths under 18 to consult with an attorney before they could waive their Miranda rights. Current law has that protection for youths only through the age of 15. Journalists would be cleared to go behind police lines during California protests and demonstrations under other legislation on its way to the governor. That bill would also prohibit police officers from intentionally assaulting, interfering with, or obstructing or citing a member of the press. The Assembly was also set to take final action on a Senate-approved bill that would ban police officers from using chokeholds and carotid holds. Both chambers need to take final votes on a bill that would expand on a law from last year that lifted some of the nation's most secretive police records by requiring public access to disciplinary records involving investigations into officer misconduct. This year's legislation would add records of discipline against officers accused of racist or discriminatory actions or those who have a history of wrongful arrests or searches. The state Senate has approved a measure aimed at preventing a wave of evictions during the deadly COVID-19 pandemic. It gives tenants a 5-month reprieve before they have to pay their full rent. In the meantime, they're expected to pay at least a quarter of it, with the other 75% becoming consumer debt that would not trigger an eviction. Christopher Martinez reports.
With a state moratorium on evictions about to end, California lawmakers and Governor Gavin Newsom hammered out a compromise to try to keep people in their homes. Monday afternoon, the state Senate voted to approve Assembly Bill 3088, a bill by Democratic Assemblymember David Chu of San Francisco. Democratic Senator Ana Caballero of Salinas presented the measure on the Senate floor.
As you know, the Judicial Council's Emergency Rule 1 will be rescinded tomorrow, and tenants across the state will be at risk of eviction. That is why we must act today to establish new protections to get us through the next few months to prevent a wave of mass evictions in the middle of a public health emergency with no clear end in sight.
Democrat Stephen Bradford of Gardena spoke in support of the measure. He says more than 1 million households in California have lost jobs due to COVID-19, including 1 in 7 renters.
It is time for this legislature to act now to help bridge this crisis. This bill protects tenants struggling because of COVID-19 without writing them a blank check. It also helps, again, those small landlords, both with a partial rent payment and potential forbearance. This by no means is a handout, just a hand, again, during this crisis. This is exactly what is needed at this time, and I respectfully ask for a vote.
The bill would bar evictions for missing rent payments until the end of January if the tenant declares a financial hardship because of the pandemic. Tenants would still be expected to pay 25% of their rent for the next 5 months. If they don't pay that 25%, a landlord could file for eviction starting in February. Some tenants' rights activists are blasting the bill, calling it a weak compromise that leaves out some tenants. They also oppose provisions that block cities from passing their own stronger eviction moratorium measures. Many Republican lawmakers were also less than enthusiastic. Senator Andres Porras of Fresno is one of several Republicans who cast what they called a reluctant aye vote. He says he will oppose any move to extend the eviction protections after the bill expires.
This ends in January. It can't go beyond that. And I know there are folks that are going to want to see this go on for, the duration of the pandemic or the end of the declared state of emergency, or realistically, until everyone is economically back on their feet. But that is, I don't believe, sustainable.
Assemblymember David Chu, the bill's lead author, says the bill is not the ultimate solution, but he hopes it will, in his words, tide us over for the next 5 months. Democrat Hannah Beth Jackson of Santa Barbara says there is more work to be done, and the federal government needs to step up.
California doesn't can't print money. We have to balance our budget. But the federal government does have the ability to come in and be helpful. It is my hope that we will get the leadership, the so-called leadership in Washington, to step up, because this problem has been created by a failure in addressing a pandemic that has put so many people at risk and killed over 180,000 Americans.
The measure passed out of the Senate on a vote of 33-2, sending it to the Assembly for a final vote. With the governor already promising to sign it, it looks like a done deal, but Democratic Senator Caballero says it's only a temporary solution.
If we all had a crystal ball, we'd look at it and we'd know when the COVID pandemic is going to end, what's going to happen to the economy, when are people going to get back to work. None of that is possible at this time. So after this bill is signed, our work still continues.
Reporting for Pacifica Radio News KPFA, I'm Christopher Martinez.
Community groups from across the country announced plans for a national day of action tomorrow. It will target law enforcement agency and officials who carry out evictions. The action comes in response to the expiration of a number of temporary coronavirus eviction moratorium laws across the country, leaving millions of people at risk of losing their homes next month. Scott Baba reports.
Housing activists and lawmakers from across the country announced plans for an anti-eviction day of action for September 1st, the day when a number of COVID-related housing protections expire across the country, leaving millions of Americans vulnerable to possible evictions. Maurice B.P. Weeks is co-director of the Action Center on Race and the Economy, or ACRE. It's a racial justice organizing group. He said that the fallout from COVID-19 was both powerful and far-reaching.
COVID-19 has led to nearly 200,000 deaths in the country, and for many more, totally destroyed their ability to have any income or job. A staggering 30 to 40 million people are at risk of eviction unless massive state and federal action is taken. That's about 10% of the entire country's population and over a third of all renters who are at risk of eviction.
Renata Pumaral, chief of staff for ACRE, said it is urgent to address the looming eviction crisis.
Tomorrow, rent is due. Millions of tenants still cannot pay rent, and millions are at risk of eviction. On this call today, we have courageous tenant leaders who are at the risk of eviction and are calling for no evictions and no police in our communities, and who are still fighting for the cancellation of rent for the duration of this pandemic.
Among the activities planned for what is being called the No Evictions, No Police Day of Action are protests against eviction enforcing law enforcement agencies and eviction courts, Know Your Rights summits to discuss eviction rights and laws with people who may not know what protections they're entitled to, and eviction defense training courses. Democratic Representative Ilhan Omar of Minnesota said that she was working on a number of bills addressing the COVID-related eviction crisis, including one that would redirect government resources spent on evictions to housing, counseling, and legal aid, and another that would offer rent and mortgage relief until the COVID pandemic was over. And to truly address the root of the problem will require a change in how Americans view the fundamental nature of housing itself.
The truth is the housing crisis didn't begin with COVID crisis. Families have long been struggling with homelessness and housing insecurity. And instead of addressing a social economic problem with social economic solutions, we have relied on law enforcement and decriminalization of poverty. The pandemic has only exacerbated the deep disparities within our housing system. There is a better way forward. We can invest in housing on a larger scale, not seen since the New Deal. If we as a nation have the moral courage to make housing a fundamental human right, then our entire society will be better off.
I'm Scott Bowell, Pacific Radio.
While tens of millions of people in the country are struggling to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table because of the coronavirus pandemic induced by the recession, the net worth of Amazon's Jeff Bezos, the richest man in the world, has topped $200 billion. Bezos' wealth has surged by $87 billion this year alone, driven by the growth in online sales during the pandemic. Bloomberg reports the world's 500 richest people have gained $809 billion so far this year, a 14% increase since January. Elon Musk of Tesla and Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg have also experienced massive increases in their wealth. Public service workers and child care providers plan to hold a last-ditch rally this evening to put pressure on San Mateo Democratic Assemblyman Mark Berman to vote for two bills to raise taxes on super-rich Californians. Advocates say the tax hike is needed to avoid huge cuts in education, health care, and more. The physically distanced protest was to take place in front of Berman's Los Altos office. Suzanne Potter reports on the underlying legislation.
The California legislature is expected to adjourn tonight without voting on bills to raise taxes on the wealthy, disappointing advocates who had hoped to avoid massive budget cuts. By law, California cannot run a deficit, so without new revenues, billions in cuts to state services and agencies may be triggered this fall and next year. Mike Harold with the Western Center on Law and Poverty says the bills would have raised an estimated $23 billion. Funds, he says, are needed to prevent widespread suffering on top of the chaos already wrought by the pandemic.
These matters would prevent devastating cuts to things like the K-12 system, the child care, Medi-Cal benefits, in-home supportive services, welfare. Recessions often cause us to cut when we probably need to be paying out the benefits at the highest level.
Opponents of taxing the rich say tax increases would cause high-income families to flee the state. AB 1253 would increase taxes by 1% on income over $1 million a year, and AB 2088 would add a 0.04% tax on personal wealth for couples making more than $30 million a year. The bill's supporters vow to try again next session. Instead, state leaders are calling on the U.S. Senate to pass another stimulus bill with billions of federal dollars to plug holes in state budgets. But Christopher Calhoun, union spokesperson for SEIU California, says he isn't optimistic because Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has criticized the idea of helping the states.
We're relying as a blue state with clear-eyed leadership on Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump to come to our rescue, and I cannot believe that that's our strategy.
The coalition, known as Commit to Equity, says they'll press for a special session in the fall to deal with this fiscal cliff. The coalition includes groups focused on health care, environmental justice, education, immigrants, labor, poverty, and more. For Public News Service, I'm Suzanne Potter.
This is the Pacifica Evening News on KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, and KFCF Fresno. I'm Eileen Alfandary. Still to come tonight, new charges at the head of the FDA is caving in to President Trump after Stephen Hahn says he may authorize deployment of a vaccine before Stage 3 trials are completed, and a historic flight from Israel to the United Arab Emirates with Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner aboard. Hot, dry weather returning to parts of Northern California threatened to make conditions worse for firefighters who are closing in on 3 massive wildfires in the Bay Area and Santa Cruz. The weather conditions also mean stagnant, unhealthy air quality for the Bay Area. The Bay Area Air Quality Management District has extended its Spare the Air alert through tomorrow. Nearly 2,800 firefighters are battling the 3 blazes ignited by lightning 2 weeks ago. CAL FIRE reported the LNU North Bay blaze was 63% contained, the SCU East Bay blaze 60%, and the CZU Santa Cruz and San Mateo wildfire 39% contained. California Battalion Chief Chris Waters on the LNU blaze said the Wall Bridge fire west of Healdsburg had control lines all the way around it, but fire-damaged trees are a concern.
One additional factor out here that's complicating is that fire-damaged trees and hazards to firefighters on the ground are being mitigated. We have folks called timber fallers. They're out there cutting the trees down and making sure that the folks that are working around the fire edge and within the interior of the fire are safe from falling debris and that kind of thing.
Officials warned residents returning to previously evacuated areas to also be alert to the danger posed by fire-damaged trees. The number of confirmed coronavirus cases globally has topped 25 million, according to a tally kept by Johns Hopkins University. The U.S. leads the count with more than 6 million cases and more than 183,000 deaths. The true number of people infected by the virus around the world and in the U.S. is believed to be much higher, perhaps 10 times higher in the U.S., according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, given the testing limitations and the many mild cases that have gone unreported or unrecognized. The head of the Food and Drug Administration says he may authorize deployment of a vaccine before Stage 3 trials are completed. Dr. Stephen Hahn told the Financial Times the FDA is willing to authorize a vaccine before the end of Phase 3 clinical trials, as long as officials believe the benefits outweigh the risks. Hahn denied he's receiving any pressure from President Trump, even though Trump has been touting the possibility of a vaccine being ready before the end of the year. Despite the denial of pressure from the president, outside health experts say Hahn's remarks appear to be only the latest in a series of examples of presidential politics overriding science at the FDA and at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Last week, Hahn was forced to backtrack after he grossly misstated the benefits so far of the experimental use of blood plasma from recovered coronavirus cases to treat those battling the infection. Dr. John Swartzberg is a UC Berkeley clinical professor emeritus of epidemiology. He told Upfront host Brian Edwards Teekert the risk of the repeated instances of politicizing the country's premier governmental scientific agencies is the public won't trust them anymore.
It's apparent, I think, to most people that what's happening, and when you politicize an institution like the FDA, then how will the public really trust its proclamations? And that will be just a tragedy. Let's say, for example, that the vaccine really does work well and the vaccine or vaccines really are safe. But if people don't trust that, they're not going to want to get vaccinated, understandably. That's why it's so critical that institutions like the FDA and OSHA and the CDC and the other government institutions have to rely on science and not politics.
So here, the specific source of suspicion is that it appears to be a political push to create some good news before Election Day.
Well, that's the suspicion, and that's what becomes reality if people suspect that's the case, and frankly, I do. But if people suspect that's the case, even if it's not, it doesn't matter because nobody's going to trust what the FDA says. And that represents a terrible tragedy. We've always, we can go way back to thalidomide when the Europeans had approved this drug during pregnancy, but the FDA really stuck by the science and didn't, and we saw the consequences of that. So many thousands of people were spared the tragedy of thalidomide.
Thalidomide, you'll have to refresh me because this is before my time. This was an anti-nausea drug that turned out to create birth defects?
Exactly. Nausea and anxiety during pregnancy looked to be completely safe, and then tragically children were born with a disease called phocomelia, which their limbs didn't develop.
Dr. Schwartzberg, the other kind of politicization of the public health effort was a piece of news that came out earlier last week, which was that the Centers for Disease Control weakened their guidance on testing. In other words, they said they recommend testing for COVID-19 to a smaller set of people based on exposure than they had previously. And apparently this is a decision that was finalized while Dr. Anthony Fauci was under anesthesia for a pre-planned procedure. What's your take on the new testing guidance?
The same as our previous discussion. It made absolutely no sense. It flies in the face of all public health policy, essentially saying that we don't need to test people who had a significant exposure if they're asymptomatic is completely wrong and against the science. And the scientists knew that. You'll notice that there were no interviews with the scientists at CDC that are reported by the journalists. And the reason for that is they're not allowed to talk. And so the only voice we had was people who were under the influence of the White House or directly under the influence of the White House saying that this is good science. And of course it was not. It was quite the opposite. So the Redfield and others tried to backtrack a little bit after that, but the damage was already done. When it becomes apparent to the vast majority of people in this country that the decisions that the CDC is making are not based upon strong science, but they're based upon wanting to get the numbers down because a politician wants the numbers down. That was Trump. And the way you get the numbers down is by don't test as much. And who's going to trust the CDC? And yet the CDC is filled with fabulous people, just outstanding scientists who are completely dedicated, like so many others, to controlling this pandemic. But we don't hear their voices. These two examples last week absolutely broke my heart.
Dr. John Schwartzberg is a UC Berkeley clinical professor emeritus of epidemiology. You can hear the entire interview archived online on this morning's edition of Upfront at kpfa.org. Chico State University has canceled the limited number of in-person classes it was offering. Classes will be online only for the duration of the fall semester after at least 30 people tested positive for the coronavirus days after the fall semester started. University President Gail Hutchinson said students also need to vacate campus housing by the weekend. She said nearly all on-campus residences have at least one positive case, and they're concerned the numbers will increase. A quick look at how the rest of the world is faring with COVID-19. First to India, which has shattered a new world record for a single-day reported increase in coronavirus cases. Nearly 79,000 new cases, 948 new deaths. India has now reported more than 75,000 infections for 4 straight days. More from Ishan Garg.
India recorded 78,000 fresh cases on Monday, but the Indian government plans to allow more businesses to resume and is lifting restrictions on movement in urban areas. New rules allow gyms, sports and concert venues to reopen, but only with a maximum gathering of 100 people. Subway services in bigger cities such as Delhi and Mumbai will also resume. This is despite experts arguing that local travel is likely to be the biggest cause of the spike in cases. India now has 3.5 million cases of COVID-19 and is likely to have the highest number of cases in the world by the end of the year. Ishan Garg, New Delhi.
Next to Russia, which is approaching nearly 1 million reported coronavirus cases. Only the U.S., Brazil, and India have reported more. Lucy Taylor reports from Moscow.
Russia's total of 990,000 confirmed cases is the fourth largest outbreak in the world. In a country with a population of 140 million, less than half the size of the United States. In July, Health Minister Mikhail Murashko warned that people shouldn't expect a return to normal life until at least February next year. But for many people here, the panic has gone. In the capital, Moscow, many people work, shop and socialise as normal without masks or social distancing. And this week, schools will reopen, a new test of the country's virus controls as cases approach 1 million.
Lucy Taylor in Moscow.
The French education minister says not all French classrooms can safely reopen tomorrow, despite the fact that's what the government had wanted and planned. The announcement came in the face of a persistent rise in coronavirus infections. A group of French doctors published an appeal over the weekend saying the government's school virus measures aren't strict enough. The doctors urged mask requirements for children as young as 6 and a mix of online and in-person schooling. France reported more than 5,400 new daily infections on Saturday. That was compared to several hundred a day in May and June. Hong Kong authorities say nearly 500,000 people have registered for a free universal coronavirus testing program due to begin tomorrow. Hong Kong launched the program in an effort to try to track down how and where the infection is spreading, despite rules requiring strict social distancing and other measures. Critics say the government is unlikely to succeed in meeting that objective. Richard Kimba reports.
The government says the free mass test is the best way to bring the coronavirus situation in the city under control and help society get back to normal as quickly as possible. Chief Executive Carrie Lam says anyone who is actively discouraging people from taking part is an anti-Beijing troublemaker whose sole objective is to smear the government. The testing program is facing multiple critics, with some health experts questioning whether a voluntary test with limited participation will provide any meaningful results, and some pro-democracy groups are warning that a mass test event may increase rather than protect against the current level of public virus transmission.
That's Richard Kimba reporting. This is the Pacifica Evening News on KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, KFCF Fresno. You can hear the news each night at 6, a half hour on the weekend. It's archived online at kpfa.org. I'm Eileen Alfandary.
Hey everyone, this is Brian Edwards-Teekert.
And I'm Kat Brooks.
Weekday mornings we host Upfront.
2 hours of conversation about what's in the news and what should be.
Politics, technology.
Prisons, police.
What's happening in City Hall and at the State House.
In Washington and in the streets.
That's starting at 7 a.m., right after Democracy Now!
On Upfront.
The fight over mail-in ballots in Texas has expanded to Houston. The state's Republican leaders are suing the city over a plan to send mail-in ballot applications to more than 2 million registered voters. Republican Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton announced the lawsuit. Texas is one of the few states that does not allow more people to vote by mail or doesn't plan to in November to avoid coronavirus infection. Texas generally restricts mail voting to people who are 65 or older, have a disability, or will be outside the county on Election Day. Harris County officials said they would leave it up to each voter who would get an application to decide whether or not they are eligible. Following the Republican National Convention and the Democratic Convention before it, two more political conventions took place this weekend, the Black National Convention and the People's Convention. Lily Bolke reports.
Two progressive conventions this weekend, following the two major parties, appeared to counter the Republican talking point that Joe Biden is a, quote, radical socialist. Kayla Reed of Action St. Louis, with the Movement for Black Lives, helped host the Black National Convention of 2020.
We are convening under the weight of a pandemic with 180,000 lives lost, an authoritarian federal government, and white nationalist forces empowered by the current president to stalk and harm Black dissenters.
Friday, they adopted a platform with policies that neither major party has embraced.
It is not enough to simply utter the words Black Lives Matter. We demand more.
Last night at the online People's Convention, true to their name, the Movement for a New People's Party voted to launch a new party without corporate money or influence to help break the dominance of the two-party system. Here's former Ohio State Senator Nina Turner, a leading progressive activist.
We're going to get through 2020. We're going to get that neo-fascist out of the White House. And baby, we're going to get to work on the People's Party.
Many speakers are still supporting Biden in November. Others back Green Party candidate Howie Hawkins. Responding to the RNC speeches, he refers to his running mate.
You know, Biden's not the socialist in this race. Me and Angela Walker are the socialists in this race.
From Pacifica Network and Public News Service, I'm Lily Bolke.
Tributes continue to pour in for actor Chadwick Boseman. Those honoring the Black Panther star include former President Obama, who met Boseman at the White House, and Boseman's Marvel Studios co-stars Scarlett Johansson and Robert Downey Jr. Boseman died on Friday at the age of 43, 4 years after he was diagnosed with colon cancer. Obama tweeted, quote, Chadwick came to the White House to work with kids when he was playing Jackie Robinson. You could tell right away he was blessed to be young, gifted, and Black, to use that power to give them heroes to look up to do it all while in pain. What a use of his years, Obama tweeted. Flags will fly at half-mast next weekend in the actor's home state of South Carolina. Simon Marks filed this report.
The star of Black Panther had been suffering from colon cancer for the last 4 years. He continued to work despite the medical treatment he was undergoing. In his career, he played a slew of historic African Americans, Jackie Robinson, James Brown, Thurgood Marshall, making history of his own along the way. And as he explained to an audience at the American Film Institute last year, when his talent was first exhibiting itself and he wanted to study drama at Oxford University in the UK, another great actor, Denzel Washington, agreed to pay for it.
He gracefully and privately agreed to contribute. As fate would have it, I was one of the students that he paid for. Imagine receiving a letter that your benefactor was none other than the dopest actor on the planet. An offering from a sage and a king is more than silver and gold. It is a seed of hope, a bud of faith. There is no Black Panther without Denzel Washington.
This weekend, Denzel Washington called Chadwick Boseman a gentle soul and a brilliant artist who will stay with us for eternity. With FSN Spotlight, I'm Simon Marks.
Another legal twist in the case of President Trump's first national security advisor, Michael Flynn. A federal appeals court rejected the attempt by Attorney General William Barr to dismiss Flynn's case immediately. The D.C.-based appeals court ruled that federal judge Emmett Sullivan was entitled to scrutinize the Justice Department's request to dismiss the case against Flynn, who had pleaded guilty and admitted to lying to the FBI during the Russia investigation. At issue before the appeals court was whether Judge Sullivan could be forced to grant the Justice Department's dismissal request without even holding a hearing to examine the basis for that motion. An Israeli El Al plane flew from Israel to the United Arab Emirates today, carrying a high-ranking U.S. and Israeli delegation to Abu Dhabi and the first-ever direct commercial passenger flight between the two countries. The U.S. delegation included President Trump's senior advisor and son-in-law, Jared Kushner, as well as National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien. Israel was represented by its National Security Advisor and other top officials. At an airport ceremony upon arriving in Abu Dhabi, Kushner called the visit a historic breakthrough and expressed hope it would be the first of many such flights. The Israeli flight flew over Saudi Arabian airspace shortly after takeoff and later passed over the Saudi capital Riyadh. That marked another historic first for Israel and signaled acquiescence by the Saudis for the UAE's move. Al Jazeera reported that the plane carrying the U.S. and Israeli delegations had the word peace written on it in English, Hebrew, and Arabic. Al Jazeera said it was also named after Kiryat Gat, which was built on the remains of two previously Palestinian villages whose residents were forced to flee following the 1948 Mideast War. Palestinian Prime Minister Mohammed Shtayyeh criticized the flight as very painful and a clear and blatant violation of the Arab position toward the Arab-Israeli conflict. More from William Denislow.
Among the delegates travelling from Israel to the UAE was US President Donald Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor Jared Kushner. Speaking to reporters at Tel Aviv's Ben Gurion Airport, Kushner said that the future doesn't have to be predetermined by the past. The pact between Israel and the UAE is the first such move in more than 20 years, and the direct flight itself through Saudi airspace was historic in itself. Officials are set to explore areas of bilateral cooperation between Israel and the Gulf power in areas including tourism and commerce. Some members of the Palestinian Liberation Organization have criticized the pact as a meaningless spectacle that won't bring peace to the region. William Danslow, New York.
A tweet today from a newly married woman brought the first sighting of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg in months. She was officiating at an outdoor wedding yesterday. The photo of the 87-year-old Ginsburg, who announced in July she's being treated for cancer again, shows her during the ceremony of Barb Solish and Danny Kazin, according to Solish's Twitter feed. Solish tweeted, quote, 2020 has been rough, but yesterday was supreme. In the photo, Ginsburg is wearing her judicial robe with a decorative black and white embroidered collar. A spokeswoman said that Ginsburg is a close friend of one of the families, and the festivities took place outdoors at a private residence. Solish noted on Twitter both she and her husband tested negative before the ceremony. LA Metro, the Los Angeles Public Transit Agency, is considering eliminating fares altogether to help passengers cope with the economic fallout of the coronavirus pandemic. Dan Fritz reports.
The plan is to deliver a proposal by the end of the year. Ideas include getting grants, selling advertising, and repurposing other funds. Before the pandemic, Metro officials say they collected about $250 million in fares per year, but had nearly $2 billion in operating expenses. Metro officials say no other large transit system in the world has gone entirely fareless. Metro has been accused of targeting people of color for fare enforcement. Officials say going fareless would eliminate the allegations of bias and would possibly save money in legal costs. Dan Fritz, Pacifica Radio, KPFK, Los Angeles.
The California legislature has passed what backers say is the strongest student borrower bill of rights in the nation. The measure aims to set up protections from loan servicing abuses that can increase loan costs. Consumer Reports, Next Gen California, and the Student Borrower Protection Center are among the bill's sponsors. The debate on the role of policing and redirecting funds from law enforcement has spilled over to the nation's schools. Not only in the Bay Area, but elsewhere in the country, advocates are calling for the removal of cops from the schools and spending money instead on counselors and other resources for school children. Nadia Ramlagan reports.
The national spotlight on police violence has many re-examining the role of police officers in schools. Before the pandemic, nearly 2 million kids nationwide attended a school with a law enforcement officer on staff, but not a school counselor, according to a report by the Justice Policy Institute. The Institute's Mark Schindler says millions of federal, state, and local dollars are spent on school resource officers with little evidence of their value. He hopes the pandemic is giving districts a chance to rethink their priorities when kids return to classrooms.
With schools being very, very hard pressed from a budget perspective over the next several years, and when we know schools are understaffed already with mental health counselors, why would we make a decision to have law enforcement in schools when we don't have enough counselors?
Last year, Governor Bill Lee signed Senate Bill 803, which provided $30 million in grants to districts across the state to fund school resource officers. With state and local school district funding combined, it's estimated Tennessee spends about $50 million annually on school safety. Schindler points to recent research in the Journal of Criminology and Public Policy. It found the presence of police officers in schools doesn't reduce crime and might actually result in more incidents of weapon and drug-related activity.
And there's no research that shows that having a police officer in a school makes it safer, which of course is the only reason that people believe they should be there. And there's research to show kids feel less safe and black and brown kids get referred to the justice system.
The Justice Policy Institute report found schools with a resource officer had nearly 5 times the arrest rates for disorderly conduct as schools without an officer on campus. Schindler adds school staff tend to rely on law enforcement to handle even minor problems. A few decades ago, they might have chosen to call a child's parents.
What that has meant is that far too often, behavior that used to be dealt with in a principal's office now too often gets dealt with in the police precinct.
He notes the issue of escalating minor school infractions into the criminal justice system has been recognized by the U.S. Department of Justice as a potential risk of employing police officers in schools. For Public News Service, I'm Nadia Ramlagan.
California lawmakers have voted to set up a task force to study and make recommendations for reparations to African Americans. The state Senate supported creating the 9-member commission on a bipartisan vote. It returns to the Assembly for final consideration. The bill would require the task force to study the impact of slavery in California and recommend to the legislature by July of 2023 the form of compensation that should be awarded, how it should be awarded, and who should be eligible. A Republican congressional nominee in Alabama has deleted but failed to apologize for a social media post of a meme that appeared to support 17-year-old Kyle Rittenhouse, who's charged with killing the 2 protesters in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Alabama Republican congressional nominee Barry Moore posted memes, including one showing Rittenhouse carrying a rifle with the caption, quote, "fought back," and what appeared to be 2 other people slumped on the ground during protests with the caption, "didn't fight back." The Democratic candidate in the Alabama race called Moore's post wrong and said as the nation grapples with ending systemic inequality, we need leaders committed to fairness and compassion, not ones who stoke division. Moore wrote a follow-up post calling the situation complicated and said he was troubled that a young man felt compelled to take up arms to protect lives and property. Rittenhouse lived in neighboring Illinois and crossed state lines to come to Kenosha to be part of a militia. Residents of the Louisiana and Texas Gulf Coast are digging out from under the wreckage brought last week when Hurricane Laura tore through the region. Federal and state officials are now on the ground to help residents with home repairs and hotel stays. As evacuated Lake Charles, Louisiana residents began returning home, many worried they wouldn't have enough support as they face a rebuilding process certain to take several months, if not much longer. Weather forecast for the San Francisco Bay Area. Partly cloudy morning skies, then sunny and hazy with smoke from the wildfires affecting air quality. Highs in the 70s to mid-80s around the bay, low 90s well inland. In Los Angeles, low clouds and fog in the morning, then sunny with highs from the upper 60s to mid-70s at the beaches, the lower 80s inland. In Fresno and the central San Joaquin Valley, sunny with areas of smoke in the morning, haze throughout the day, highs 94 to 99 degrees. Thanks for joining us tonight on the Pacifica Evening News. Janine Eder produced recorded portions, and she's at the controls. I'm Eileen Alfandary.
Uno, dos, tres, cuatro, cinco.